Chapter 139, Situation of Things. I want to ask of the association current thoughts on these cracks, Michael said. Since the other party preferred to get straight to the point, Michael, who also appreciated this direct style of conversation, immediately jumped to what was on his mind without any unnecessary detours. Though part of his mind was distracted by the fact that he was floating midair without assistance, Michael forced himself to stay calm. He could feel a strange mana signature all around him, and could only assume it was Brian using one of his techniques to keep him afloat. While he spoke, thoughts of just how strong Brian might truly be lingered in his mind as he waited patiently for an answer. Fortunately, he didn't have to wait long. "We'll handle the cracks, don't worry," Brian said slowly and deliberately, pausing before continuing. "We've called for help from other associations to send more king-rank experts since they're the only ones capable of dealing with this. The request has been confirmed, so there's no need for you to worry. You won't be called to fight, not that you're capable of contributing much anyway." Michael's eyelid twitched. For a moment, he wondered if Brian was simply trying to reassure him, or if he was subtly insulting him. Either way, he couldn't deny that the words brought some relief. However, Michael wasn't done yet. He still had a few doubts lingering in his mind. Fortunately, since Brian had answered his first question, it seemed he was willing to entertain a few more. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. So, let's say reinforcements do arrive. Even then, when the monsters come out of the cracks, it might not be the monsters that destroy the city. It could very well be the shockwaves caused by those king-rank experts fighting them, Michael said calmly. Michael's mind flashed to the mysterious figure bathed in blue flames he'd seen earlier. If the monsters in the crack were as strong as that figure, who he believed could level the city with ease, then the city's survival seemed grim. The sky wasn't enough to protect those below, especially if the shockwaves from such clashes were as devastating as he imagined. "You don't have to worry about that," Brian interjected, reading Michael's thoughts. "If you could think of it, the association has naturally accounted for it already." Michael blinked, feeling the faint sting of what he suspected might be another subtle insult. However, Brian's indifferent expression showed no malice, as though what he had just said was entirely neutral. Just because a crack is close to breaking doesn't mean it can't be stopped entirely, or at least delayed, Brian continued. Michael felt like he'd stumbled upon something profound. "Didn't you say before that nothing could stop a crack from appearing unless they were a god?" "I did," Brian confirmed. "And I stand by that. I've never heard of a king rank or even an emperor rank cultivator preventing a crack from appearing, but no one said you couldn't close it after it appears." "Oh, you might think this is common sense since crack clearing is something you're familiar with. You've even cleared a few yourself," Brian began, his tone calm but deliberate. He gestured toward one of the cracks around them. "But what I'm talking about here isn't normal cracks. I'm talking about cracks like this, ones close to breaking." Michael immediately caught on. If he wasn't mistaken, Brian was implying there was a way to deal with the monsters in these cracks before they emerged. A spark of realization flickered in Michael's mind. "Cracks can still be entered even if they're close to breaking," Michael ventured. "Yes," Brian confirmed. "The issue isn't entering. The problem is the monsters inside. They aren't just more numerous than those in regular crack clears. They're also near the strength limit of the crack itself. However, since these cracks are somewhat artificially created, the monsters' numbers aren't overwhelming, and their strength is at the lower end of what this crack can handle." Hearing this explanation, the pieces finally fell into place for Michael. Without Brian needing to say more, he understood the association's plan, to deal with the cracks from the inside while minimizing the damage to the city below. Feeling slightly more at ease, Michael turned his attention to another curiosity. He hesitated, unsure if he should speak, but under Brian's gaze he finally did. "The scar on your face, it's gone, and not just that." Michael trailed off, glancing at Brian's hair, now jet black, and his youthful appearance. He wanted to ask when Brian had dyed his hair, or why he seemed so much younger. Unfortunately, he didn't get the chance. "All right, it's time for you to leave," Brian said abruptly, cutting him off. "Some old fogies are already arriving." "Old fogies? What do you mean?" Before Michael could finish his sentence, he found himself standing in a dark alleyway. There was no sign of Brian anywhere. "He really does things at his own pace, doesn't he?" Michael muttered. There was something else Michael had noticed about Brian. The threatening aura Brian had always exuded seemed to have vanished. Back in midair, a man and a woman appeared before Brian. Both looked to be in their early 30s, but anyone familiar with them knew these two had centuries behind them. Being over 200 years old in Aurora didn't necessarily mean someone had lived through the start of the Dark Age. No, there were places in the universe where time moved faster. Take the void between realms, for example. In the worst cases, a day in Aurora could equate to 30 years for a powerful cultivator traveling through the void. Just as Michael and others had thought, if a powerful individual wanted to come to Woodstone City as reinforcement, it wouldn't take long, even if they were hundreds of miles away. The real issue was whether the situation would deteriorate beyond saving before reinforcements could arrive. Fortunately for Woodstone City, or perhaps unfortunately, considering the severity of their predicament, the reinforcements they needed were king-rank cultivators. With void nodes in place, the Federation's summons to these exalted beings brought swift responses. Even the furthest among them took mere minutes to arrive. Within moments of the first two king-rank cultivators appearing, 10 more joined them, surrounding Brian and the earlier pair. For a brief moment, the space around them trembled as terrifying auras clashed, warping the atmosphere with their sheer intensity. Among the 13 figures, only Brian appeared ordinary. As fellow king-rank cultivators, they could sense the immense power he contained, a power hidden beneath an unassuming exterior. However, for those weaker than him, such as Michael, it was impossible to detect. This wasn't because Brian had grown weaker. No, it was the opposite. Brian's strength had reached a level so far beyond Michael's comprehension that it no longer registered. Michael didn't delude himself into thinking he had grown stronger, or that Brian's lack of threat indicated a change in their dynamic. He knew he was barely any different from when the chaos started. Brian had stopped him with minimal effort before, and there was no reason to believe that had changed. Now, however, the aura Brian exuded wasn't just intimidating, it was unfathomable. Slowly, Michael's subconscious sense of superiority as an awakener began to crumble. He realized there was so much he didn't understand about cultivators. They were formidable. Even though his confidence as an awakener remained, Michael had to admit cultivators were a force to be reckoned with. As for Brian, a growing suspicion nagged at Michael, a thought he didn't dare entertain fully but couldn't dismiss. Brian's changed appearance, his strange display of power. Michael couldn't help but wonder, was Brian the figure who had rained down blue flames to suppress the chaos engulfing the city? For some reason, Michael felt his guess wasn't far from the truth. To be honest, though he was indifferent to cultivating, the idea of it intrigued him at times. Unfortunately, cultivation could only boost his stats incrementally, and it was a long-term investment. As an awakener with no limits, Michael could no longer ignite a life seed, a prerequisite for cultivation. There was nothing he could do about it. He wasn't naturally talented. If he were, perhaps he'd be like Brian during his school years, a genius who managed to awaken a second class, because he had ignited a life seed before awakening. Several king-rank cultivators eyed Brian, each with a mix of thoughts after seeing his appearance and sensing his aura. Some were curious. Some frowned. Some remained neutral. The Mad Phoenix. Even emperors had heard of him. Part of it was because some of these emperors had been from the same generation during the past century. Congratulations, Mad Phoenix. Finally, someone in the crowd spoke. It was one of the older individuals, his voice filled with a sense of recognition. Brian immediately recognized him. Quiet Blade, one of the most renowned assassins in the Federation. No one knew how many times he had traveled through the void to assassinate powerful figures in other realms. His slightly graying appearance was a clear sign of his age. At least he was one of the oldest present, and his realm as a mid-stage king-rank knight reflected that a little. There were a few others of similar strength among the gathered, but none dared oppose Brian. Before his advancement, Brian had already shown signs of dominating the ranks of early-stage king-rank knights. Now, after advancing, it was clear that his strength had grown immeasurably. The Mad Phoenix. No one could still look at him with the perspective of an early king-rank knight. Even the faintest trace of his aura shattered that illusion. Such an evildoer. Though not everyone around Brian shared the same opinion, they all had one thought in common. When did he advance? The Mad Phoenix had been stuck at the brink of a breakthrough for years, teetering on the edge but never quite crossing the threshold. So what had changed now? At least that much piqued their curiosity. With Quiet Blade taking the lead, those who were interested moved forward to Brian. Brian responded with varying levels of indifference and calmness, depending on how each approached him. However, while some congratulated him, others questioned him passively. How did the city end up like this? A woman's voice cut through the tension. It sounded like a question born out of concern, though it lacked warmth, her tone flat and emotionless. To everyone around, the true question was obvious. How did the city end up like this with you here? Brian slowly turned to look at the woman, their eyes locking. The weight of the gazes from his peers around him made Brian lose a bit of his earlier good mood. Speaking to that brat earlier had been much more pleasant. I fought the strong man from the other side, Brian said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. It was after that battle I advanced. Then I came across this situation and immediately offered my assistance. Immediately after speaking, an overwhelming aura erupted from Brian. The surrounding kings all stiffened, their expressions growing serious. The Federation sent us here for a reason, Brian continued, his voice now more commanding. It's better we get this over with so we can return to our respective places and call it a day, shall we? In that moment, it felt as though Brian stood at the very center of the world. No one spoke. Not because they were afraid to, though some certainly didn't dare to, but because voicing any opposition to what had just been said would effectively place them at odds with Brian, who had framed his actions as a bid to protect the city. In a situation like this, any dissent could easily be used against them later. No one wanted that, especially since this mission was of great importance, not necessarily because it was about saving lives. For lower-ranked supernaturals, it might seem puzzling why powerful cultivators, whose strength leveled cities and dried rivers, still adhered to the Federation's commands. The reason was simple. The Federation had what they wanted. The same cycle had repeated since the dawn of the supernatural era. Those who did good were rewarded. These rewards weren't always unattainable for high-level cultivators, but anything that could entice king-rank supernaturals and above was bound to be extraordinarily rare and difficult to acquire. The Federation system, however, streamlined the process. What would take years of personal effort could often be obtained through service. The powerful wanted resources and opportunities to ascend further, while the Federation desired loyalty and control. This mutual need formed a delicate balance, a circle of dependency that perpetuated itself until loyalty became second nature. Of course, stronger experts enjoyed greater freedom, but even they had their limits. For most of the gathered king ranks, aside from Brian, the reason they were here was simple. The Federation had promised treasures of extraordinary value in exchange for their aid. Resources far beyond what the early city's defenders like Michael would receive, even if they had fought with their lives on the line. This wasn't about altruism. It was about power and the price to claim more of it. "What should we do now? We don't have much time," Quiet Blade interjected. Brian turned to him, his voice calm. "There are two ways we can approach this. We can either divide ourselves into small groups to address each crack, or we can pool all our forces and attack each crack with overwhelming speed and strength. In my opinion, the second option is better. Not only is it safer, but it also ensures efficiency since we'll be striking with full force. If we divide our already limited numbers, we'll not only face monsters who are just as strong as us but also their overwhelming numbers. And let's not forget, even cracks that are close to breaking require a third of their force to be killed before we can safely move on. We don't know what's waiting on the other side of these cracks, so dividing could be dangerous." Brian finished and fell silent, letting his words sink in. Quiet Blade broke the silence again. "Let's all go together. With our combined forces, even if we can't clear a crack in one go, taking down a third of its strength will delay its collapse. We can use that extra time to target other cracks, repeating the process. This method is both safe and efficient." Hearing Quiet Blade's reasoning, the gathered kings nodded in agreement. "It's better we move together. Safety in numbers. And faster, too." No one voiced a differing opinion. The logic was sound, and with their levels of power, unity only amplified their strength. With the decision made, the king-level cultivators wasted no time. After a few brief words exchanged among themselves, they flew toward the nearest crack. Without hesitation, they plunged into the crack, fully prepared to fight the moment they crossed over. Before heading home after his conversation with Brian, Michael made a detour to the Supers Association branch. The destruction from the recent chaos was still evident, but a semblance of organization had begun to return. Compared to the earlier pandemonium, the city was starting to show signs of recovery, at least starting to show one. With his sharp hearing, Michael caught the blaring of ambulance sirens in the distance, signaling that some hospitals were operational. The sound reminded him of Old Man Liu, the supervisor of the first crack he had ever entered. Michael wondered if the old man had survived the incident. A part of him hoped he had. Considering the unique environment surrounding the corrupted Goblin World crack, Michael suspected that if many of the medical facilities in that area remained intact, the crack itself would likely be thriving soon. The amount of negative energy in the ruined city was likely a feast for cracks of all kinds. In fact, Michael figured that every crack in Woodstone City was now enjoying the abundance of negative energy if nothing had happened to them. The reason Michael had come to the association instead of heading straight home was simple: Lily's injury. Taking her to a hospital might have been a good idea, but given the current state of the city, she wouldn't be a priority. Besides, Michael didn't favor the idea. Also, such a case was somewhat too light to go to an hospital for. As a supernatural, he knew there were better ways to treat injuries of her level, especially since Lily was just an ordinary human. His solution: buy a health potion. Michael recalled his first experience with a health potion. Embarrassingly, It had been on his very first day in the land of origin. The injury he'd used it on had been far worse than Lily's foot, and the potion had worked wonders. Michael was confident that not even half a bottle would be needed to relieve her pain. Unfortunately, due to the chaos in the city, Michael was only able to purchase 5 basic-grade health potions. Still, that was more than enough. He didn't need higher-grade potions, since they wouldn't be used on himself or his undead. Potions didn't work on creatures like them in the first place. As he left the trade center, holding the potions in his hand, Michael realized he had been slow to act when it came to relieving Lily's pain. It was only after buying the potions that he remembered something he had forgotten entirely. When he first prepared to enter the land of origin, he had bought more than 1 health potion. 3 to be exact. After his first injury, Michael had rarely found himself in dire need of a potion, not even during his near-death situation. As a result, he still had 2 unused potions left. "Whatever," Michael muttered to himself. "I bought more potions originally to help others in the community who might need them. The more, the better." Despite his enhanced mental faculties and high-speed thought processing, Michael was still human. Just a very powerful one. The moment Michael stepped into his community, he summoned all his undead from the netherworld to join those he had left earlier in the real world when he had gone out to hunt for more experience points under the guise of helping the public. Surveying the ruined community, Michael issued orders to his undead. The orcs were tasked with packing up the scattered monster corpses while dividing the human ones into a separate pile. A select few undead were instructed to stay on guard with Prince and the verdant wolf, while Lucky remained in its position, coiled around his fortified apartment. Michael glanced up at the sky, his expression contemplative. A few seconds earlier, he had noticed a subtle shift in the chaotic energy swirling in the air. It felt less intense, at least part of it did. "Seems like reinforcements have arrived," he muttered to himself. Though there was some uncertainty in his voice, a large part of him believed this was the case. He still recalled his brief conversation with Brian in the sky. Before returning Michael to the surface, Brian had mentioned that reinforcements were on the way. Michael had no way of knowing who exactly these reinforcements were, but considering Brian's prowess, anybody taken seriously by him, Michael figured they were likely important figures. In the current situation, important figures almost certainly meant king-rank experts. Still, Michael's heart wasn't entirely at ease. While part of him had decided to stay in Woodstone City, another part remained vigilant and ready to act if the situation suddenly worsened. He still kept a mental timer, counting down as he waited for any significant changes from the cracks in the sky. If the situation turned for the worse, he would prioritize his survival rather than relying on the Federation's protection. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Michael instructed Lucky to loosen the vines wrapped around the entrance of his apartment, just enough for him to slip inside. He could have undone the entire fortification he had created around the building, but caution kept him from doing so. Michael doubted that any strong monsters had survived the rain of blue flames, nor did he believe any weaker monsters could bypass his undead guards to reach his apartment. However, monsters were not his main concern. It was the demonic supernaturals he was worried about. Compared to the possibility of a large number of monsters surviving, Michael was more inclined to believe that a significant number of demonic supernaturals had endured. If that figure from earlier truly had been Brian, and his words about not judging individuals solely based on their presence were sincere, it suggested that other demonic supernaturals might also be hiding in the city. Even if that figure hadn't been Brian, Michael doubted anyone who wasn't a demonic supernatural would resort to such indiscriminate slaughter. In any case, that individual's mere presence was a thorn in the side of the demonic supernaturals, one they couldn't do anything about. After all, with a king-rank expert in the city, the demonic supernaturals would need someone of equivalent power on their side to retaliate. And unless they had such an individual, Michael could only respect those bold enough to raise their heads. Michael didn't bother about the people in the vine domes for now. After entering his apartment, Michael mentally commanded Lucky to close the entrance outside again. Without delay, he headed straight to his apartment door. Knock, knock. No one answered. The entire building was eerily quiet. It had been silent even before Michael knocked, and the sound of his action seemed unusually loud against the stillness. Despite the lack of noise, Michael's sharp senses picked up faint movements inside the apartment. "It's me, Aunt Mia," Michael said, his voice calm. For a second, silence reigned on the other side of the door. Just as he was about to say more, or even command beginning, who was inside with his family, he heard hurried footsteps approaching. A moment later, the door clicked open, and a familiar face appeared. Aunt Mia. She didn't even hesitate to confirm his identity before opening the door, but Michael's eyes shifted to the towering giant standing silently behind her. Beginning stood in its position, its cold, watchful gaze focused on him. Despite knowing it was its master on the other side of the door through their connection, it hadn't moved from its last order to guard his family. Michael was quietly satisfied. The moment Aunt Mia's eyes landed on him, she didn't seem to notice the blood on his body or the lingering smell of battle. Instead, she began checking him over with trembling hands. "Are you injured anywhere? This isn't your blood, right?" Michael felt the tremor in her touch, and for the first time in a while, a concerned look broke through his otherwise calm expression. Gently, he caught her hands to stop her frantic movements. "Calm down, Aunt Mia. I'm not injured. This isn't even my blood," he said softly. For a moment, it seemed his words had the opposite effect. He felt her hands tremble even more. Sensing that continuing would only worsen her distress, Michael quickly changed the subject. "Are you okay, Aunt Mia? Nothing happened while I was gone, right? How's Lily?" His words seemed to help. Michael noticed her trembling ease slightly as she spoke. "And nothing happened. Lily fell asleep. There were screams from the neighbors while you were gone. I think something must have happened." Perhaps reassured by his presence, Aunt Mia steadied herself as she finished speaking. But Michael's attention was caught on something else. A scream. Did I miss a monster that got inside? A scream. The first thought that came to Michael was that a monster might be in the building. Immediately, his expression became serious. Michael heightened his senses to their maximum, but he noticed nothing unusual. No, he did notice something. The scent of blood. It was coming from upstairs. "Where did you hear the scream from, Aunt Mia?" Michael asked, turning to look at his aunt. "Upstairs." She paused, her voice uncertain. But after a moment she added, "It should be upstairs." The scream sounded like it came from the neighbors, the family Lily usually plays with. Michael recognized the family. He wasn't close to them personally, but he had seen them around the apartment building for years. Michael didn't mention the scent of blood he had picked up. It wouldn't do Aunt Mia any good to know. Instead, he said, "I'll check it out in a minute, Aunt Mia. Let me see Lily first." Aunt Mia nodded in a daze, not giving it much thought. By now, she was beginning to understand that this nephew of hers was very different from before. She didn't know what exactly had happened after he barricaded the building, but the few things he had done so far made it clear that his awakening had changed him. As for the scream, she had only mentioned it in passing because Michael had asked. When Michael entered the apartment, he found his cousin Lily sitting on the sofa in the living room. Unlike what Aunt Mia had told him outside, she was now awake. Lily was staring at the entrance with a mix of emotions on her face that only eased when she saw Michael walk in. "How's your leg feeling?" Michael asked softly as he approached Lily and bent down. It seemed Aunt Mia had bandaged her leg in his absence. Even through the light wrapping, Michael could see that her foot was swollen. It was surprising to think that someone could get such a bad sprain at home, but it wasn't unheard of. In both his lives, Michael had heard countless stories of people sustaining the worst injuries in their own homes. "Does it hurt much?" Michael asked, brushing his hand lightly against Lily's foot. "Ouch!" Lily grimaced in pain, unable to answer, though her reaction said enough. "Sorry, just bear with it a little longer." Michael began loosening the bandage around Lily's sprained foot slowly and carefully. "What are you doing?" Aunt Mia finally asked. "I'm trying to relieve her pain," Michael replied simply. Aunt Mia's face twisted in confusion. It was clear she had no idea what Michael was about to do, but though questions burned in her mind, she kept them to herself. Ever since his awakening, she had been trying to deny how much had changed. It was all happening too fast. But it was obvious now. Michael was no longer the boy she knew. It wasn't that he had become a different person, but he had grown. He had spread his wings and was already soaring. She wasn't in a position to question him like she used to. Her boy was now a man of his own. Even so, concern lingered on Aunt Mia's face as she watched Michael carefully remove the last bit of bandage from Lily's swollen leg. Lily let out a sigh of relief as his hand left the swollen area, which hurt whenever there was pressure on it. After he finished removing the bandage, under the astonished eyes of his cousin and Aunt Mia, Michael brought out a health potion from his storage space. To the two people, who had only seen supernatural feats performed on the internet, and even then, mostly displays of immense strength, Michael's act of pulling something out of thin air left them in awe. Not paying attention to their expressions or reactions, Michael calmly unscrewed the cap of the health potion bottle and positioned it above the swollen area on Lily's foot. Neither Lily nor Aunt Mia asked what the liquid was, but the translucent green color made their hearts race. Still, the trust they had in Michael, from the years they had spent together and the fact that he had protected them during the chaos, even fighting against those terrifying monsters while others fell, gave them no reason to question him. Unlike the pain Lily expected to feel as the liquid made contact with her skin, she was met with a refreshing, soothing sensation instead. Under the amazed eyes of Aunt Mia and Lily, they watched as her skin absorbed the transparent green liquid. It washed over her body, and the swollen, red area around her foot began to visibly heal. When Michael saw the skin on her foot return to a healthy color, he stopped pouring the health potion and carefully replaced the bottle's cap. Just as he had expected, the potion had barely been used. Less than a quarter of its contents had been consumed to treat Lily's injury. As for having Lily drink the potion, Michael saw no need. She wasn't in the same situation he had been in back in the land of origin. She only had external injuries. There was no reason to waste the potion on something that was already healed. "How do you feel?" Michael asked as he placed the health potion back into his storage space. Though in awe of everything that was happening, Lily was still able to formulate a response. "Gee, good, it's not pea-painting anymore." As she spoke, she stood up on her feet, and truly she felt no pain. Everything just felt like magic. Happy that she was no longer in pain, Michael turned to look at his aunt, who was staring at the scene in amazement, and spoke, bringing her out of her daze. Michael didn't ask Aunt Mia any complicated questions, just if she herself had also been injured anywhere. Thankfully, she wasn't, aside from being exhausted, which she didn't say, though Michael didn't need to hear it to know. Unfortunately, there wasn't much he could do about that. After saying a few more words to both his cousin and aunt, and repeating his last command from before, Michael made his way outside of the apartment. It was finally time to deal with the issue his aunt had pointed out. The scream. As he made his way through the apartment building at a moderate pace, Michael's footsteps created faint echoes. With his sharp senses, he could feel the presence of people in some of the apartments. However, what they all had in common was the silence coming from the other side. The residents couldn't escape Michael's heightened senses, but from the way they all tried to suppress their presence as much as possible, Michael wondered for a moment if it had been like this when the cracks first appeared in Aurora. The apocalypse. To ordinary people, from their perspective, it truly felt like the end of the world at that moment. As Michael continued moving forward, he couldn't help but wonder what the future of the city would look like. How would the world react to this? Surely, the Federation couldn't keep such a massive incident hidden, right? If Michael had known that Woodstone City wasn't the only one under attack, he would have realized the true gravity of the current situation. Even if the government wanted to keep things under wraps, they wouldn't be able to. Even now, the news was already spreading. Soon, Michael reached the third floor of the apartment building. A moment later, he stood before a door. "It's heavy," Michael muttered, frowning slightly. Beyond the door, the scent of blood was stronger than it had been downstairs. Not only was it easier to sense, but there also seemed to be a lot of it. However, through his senses, he could detect something odd. Though he couldn't see through the door, he could tell there was a living being on the other side. The issue, however, was, there's no monster. There wasn't a monster beyond the door. It was amazing what heightened senses could achieve when pushed to a terrifying degree. At some point, one no longer needed eyes to see. Though he wouldn't call himself a master, Michael's days spent surrounded by monsters had subconsciously sharpened his ability to distinguish between monsters and humans based on their sense and breathing alone at close range. Humans gave off a unique scent, and so did monsters. Michael could hear the breathing of the other party behind the door. For one thing, a monster, at least a normal one, wouldn't suppress its breathing to avoid detection by a human, especially if it came from a crack. Such creatures were consumed by madness. It could only mean one thing. There was a human beyond the closed door. And it was someone who clearly didn't want to be discovered. Unfortunately for them, Michael was curious about the situation. Not only that, but he also needed to ensure that nothing strange was happening in the apartment building while his family was still inside. Knock, knock. Michael rapped on the door, the sound echoing loudly through the quiet building. Beyond the door, he could sense the breathing of the person inside. Suppressed yet quickened. But no response came. Silence reigned once again. Knock, knock. He knocked a second time, and like before, no answer came. Knock, knock. Michael knocked a third time. Still nothing. However, the other person's breathing seemed to steady slightly, as if they had calmed down. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Michael's lips. He felt a twinge of mischief after being ignored twice. Though he didn't know exactly what was happening beyond the door, he had a good idea based on the clues so far. Something bad had occurred, and it didn't seem to have an external cause. "You can hear me, right?" Michael finally spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. Instantly, the person's breathing quickened again. "It's me, Michael, your neighbor's nephew from downstairs," he introduced himself casually. The breathing on the other side of the door steadied slightly, but still, no words were exchanged. Michael's smile widened as his earlier suspicions solidified. "We heard screaming from here. Did something happen?" Bang! A loud noise like something breaking echoed from inside. "So you're definitely in there," Michael said, his tone calm. "Can you please open the door so we can talk?" No response came, despite the obvious noise from within. That was the final straw for Michael. Something was definitely wrong. He could understand if someone was cautious. However, with the blood of scent coming from beyond the door when there was no apparent monster anywhere, something wasn't normal. If he was mistaken, he'd apologize and pay for any damages, but he couldn't ignore this any longer. He pressed his hand against the doorknob and pushed. A strained creak echoed as the lock resisted, but it didn't stand a chance against Michael, who barely used his strength. However, just as he was about to open the door, he felt another force pressing against it. "What are you doing? Is something the matter? I know you, boy. Are you trying to steal from me because I didn't answer?" Michael paused, his movements halting as the voice barked from the other side. The speaker's voice was loud, almost deliberately so. Michael's slight smile lingered as he replied calmly, "I'm sorry, sir. I was just concerned that something had happened." The voice belonged to a man, and his raised tone seemed like a signal. Sure enough, Michael's sharp senses picked up movement all around the floor. Moments later, a few doors creaked open, and several pairs of eyes fixed on him. Some were curious. Some were filled with fear. Some were wary. Some were cautious. And some were surprised. The neighbor's nephew, on the second floor of the apartment building, had awakened. It didn't take long for the news to spread. The world was a small place after all. Michael wasn't the only one attending Woodstone Public High School No. 3, and as one of the rare individuals to awaken each year, his anonymity had quickly become a thing of the past. Even students from other schools knew about him, whether they had seen him in person or not. Some neighbors sighed at the family's newfound luck. Others envied them. A few were outright jealous. And some remained indifferent, adopting the mindset that Michael's awakening had nothing to do with them and simply continued with their lives. Regardless of their reactions, one thing everyone had in common was that Michael's name lingered in their minds. To ordinary people, becoming an awakener or cultivator symbolized taking a step closer to success. Most didn't understand the specifics, but after being told the same thing repeatedly since childhood, it became almost a traditional belief. For a brief moment, all eyes were on Michael's family. Yet, even after a few days, nothing seemed to change aside from the boy's sudden lack of presence, until now. Not many had seen Michael in action when the monsters started falling from the sky. Some witnessed it, but most quickly withdrew from any means of viewing the chaos outside. Once the building became fortified under Michael's hands, their awareness of the outside world diminished further. To the majority of people now looking at Michael, they had no idea this was the very person responsible for their survival and current safety. For the few who did know due to one reason or another, their emotions ranged from gratitude to disbelief. However, there was a reason none of them stepped forward. Michael's current appearance was terrifying. He was covered in blood, different shades and hues, but the smarter ones could tell it wasn't human blood. Combined with his identity as an awakener, most quickly assumed that he had been outside fighting monsters and somehow managed to make his way back into the building. But the person behind the door had no way of seeing Michael's current state. Like most of the people in the apartment building, they believed the eerie silence outside meant that everyone else was dead. They could still recall the sight of blood spilling everywhere when those monsters first appeared. Until Michael showed up, at least for those who were seeing him now, most believed no one could survive that carnage for long. Even now, those watching him assumed he was still alive simply because he had been inside the building. The person behind the door continued speaking. "Hey, why were you trying to break into my house? You're up to no good, right? You think that just because the government isn't responding now, you can do anything because you were lucky enough to awaken." The man continued ranting, spewing accusations, and a mix of other incoherent complaints. His words were met with silence, not only from Michael, but from everyone currently watching the scene unfold. Michael's cold gaze remained fixed on the door in front of him. The situation reminded him of what he had endured outside the apartment building. And once again, it was with someone tied to his neighbor. For a brief moment, Michael wondered if he might be doing too much. But he immediately dismissed the thought. Maybe it was an abuse of power, but if it concerned his family, Michael was more than willing to cross that line. Besides, curiosity gnawed at him now. Something was definitely wrong here. Michael took a step back from the door and moved to the side wall of the apartment, stopping a short distance away. Under the confused gazes of the onlookers, Michael extended a hand toward the wall. His palm hovered just above the surface, not touching it. The eyes of his neighbors widened in disbelief. Acid shot. A green magic circle materialized between Michael's palm and the wall. A surge of white liquid shot out from the magic circle, striking the wall. Immediately, the wall began to melt under Michael's manual control of the skill. Within seconds, an opening appeared before him, the edges still sizzling from the acidic reaction. Unfazed, Michael stepped through the newly made entrance, utterly indifferent to what he had just done. Once inside, the scent of blood grew even stronger. A man, well advanced in age, came into Michael's view. He was a familiar face. However, the man who was usually easygoing, at least on the surface before, now wore a look of panic and disbelief. His hair was disheveled, and his body was drenched in sweat. He stood there in nothing but his underwear, his bare chest rising and falling rapidly. Michael barely spared him a glance before turning his attention to the other sight before him. In the sitting room not far away, two bodies lay motionless. One was the man's wife, someone Michael had seen on occasion. The other was his daughter, someone far more familiar to Michael, Lily's friend, who had often visited their apartment. Now these two people, they were dead. Worst, their naked bodies lying on the floor hinted at a deeper, more sinister occurrence. He despised his wife. She, on the other hand, loved him deeply, a fact that sometimes stirred a flicker of guilt within him. But no matter how hard he tried to cultivate affection for her, he simply couldn't. He was a bad man, and he couldn't deny it. In his youth, driven by his lack of success and unwillingness to endure a poor life, he had seduced a lonely, sweet, and wealthy woman, a slightly chubby lady whose innocence made her an easy target. He married her, not for love but for convenience. But years later, her business suffered a massive blow, nearly costing her everything. To make matters worse, she had been pregnant at the time. Though he'd always harbored disdain for her, it was during this period that his hatred grew deeper. He could only console himself with the thought that, at least, she had a hot body and a pretty face. Even then, she was nothing more than a means to satisfy his desires in his eyes. Not even the birth of their daughter could change that. He was incapable of loving her. It wasn't until years later he started to suspect that something was truly wrong with him. His young daughter. He found himself drawn to her. He knew it was bad, he knew it was wrong. But the thoughts that ran through his mind didn't stop appearing after the first time. At least all was good until the apocalypse happened. The monsters arrived, but fortunately none reached them. However, the chaos outside was enough to terrify the family. As a father and husband, he should have taken the lead, providing security and reassurance for his family. But such thoughts didn't even cross his mind. Overwhelmed with fear, he ran to his room, intending to lock the door behind him. "Dee, don't leave. Let's move the sofas to block the door," his wife pleaded, trying to stop him. It was apparent that she had taken on the responsibility of thinking for the family instead. Perhaps it was a natural instinct for someone who had long been forced to play the role of both mother and father in their household. The same reaction had been seen with Aunt Mia when the chaos began, only for Michael to take over and ensure better safety than a few sofas could provide. Unfortunately, her words didn't bring him to his senses or awaken any semblance of responsibility. Chaos and panic had stripped him of reason. In anger, he shoved his wife away. "Leave me." But while the sight of blood and monsters had filled him with fear, it seemed to have emboldened her. Refusing to let him abandon them, she held on firmly. "Don't leave." Before she could finish, he grabbed her head and slammed it into the wall. This wasn't the first time he had resorted to violence against her, but it was the first time fear had driven him to such extremes. The force he used was far greater than he intended. Worse, the section of the wall her head struck had sharp edges. Blood flowed. "No, no, no." Ugh. Her fall was joined by a scream of fear from his daughter. Hearing her cry jolted him back to some semblance of awareness. The weight of his actions hit him like a brick. The civilized thoughts one might have in such a moment of horror filled his mind. Nobody could find out. Driven by panic, he turned toward his daughter, who had begun retreating in shock and fear. Bang! They fell to the floor, her small body pinned beneath his. "It wasn't on purpose. I didn't mean to do it. I swear I didn't mean to do it," he mumbled in broken sentences, his trembling hands covering her mouth to stifle her screams. But adrenaline can do strange things to a person. His body acted on instinct while his mind lagged behind. By the time he realized it, his daughter had stopped moving. He had suffocated her. In just a few short moments, for the first time in his life, he had taken not one but two lives. Panic consumed him. Then came the screams outside, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. He moved to close the window. The scene outside was a nightmare brought to life. Blood pooling on the streets, monsters roaming, people screaming, and the ominous red cracks in the sky splitting the heavens. "It's the end of the world," he whispered, trembling. Then he began to laugh, a hollow, broken sound. "Ha ha! It's the end of the world and I killed someone. I killed someone." The rapid series of events, the overwhelming guilt, and the terror of the apocalypse all conspired to shatter his mind. In his madness, he closed the window, locked the door, and collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down his face. "It's the end, it's the end, it's the end," he kept repeating, his eyes fixed on the lifeless bodies of his daughter and wife. The nighttime setting, and the fact that they were in their own home, meant they were dressed in little clothing. As he gazed at his daughter's exposed skin and his wife's matured body, her head still bleeding, a maniacal smile spread across his face. "The world is going to end anyway. Even if the government steps in, they'll arrest me. They'll arrest me. Let me go all out then, ha ha, ha ha." Michael frowned at the sight, struggling to comprehend the scene before him. For one of the few times in his life, he failed to understand the thought process that led to an outcome. How could one do this to their family? He couldn't fathom it. Michael was rarely ever a hypocrite. He acknowledged that he had started to see things differently since his awakening, but he believed this change was a natural consequence of his newfound power. He knew he was starting to feel distant from his family, but he never thought it would lead to forgetting about them. At least, he didn't think he'd ever reach that extent. If anything, he felt distant in the sense that he no longer saw the need to be in close proximity to them. Separation was inevitable as he continued to grow, and it seemed it was his turn. But that didn't mean he'd forget his family. He had plans for them, establishing a business for his aunt and providing resources for his cousin to aid her cultivation. Awakening wasn't a guarantee, but success in cultivation could be influenced with capability. He envisioned making both his aunt and cousin successful supernaturals, allowing them to live as long as possible. This was a goal he had in mind, though he hadn't yet started implementing it. His life had only begun changing significantly for barely a week. To Michael, family was a way of life. Few things could compare to the importance of family, especially for him, where the two Michaels happened to value this relationship deeply, even sharing the same name. This couldn't help him understand what he was seeing in front of him. Instead, he felt angry. The man seemed to tremble in rage and fear. Michael could feel he was the cause of both, or at least a significant part of it. "You bastard!" A slow curse. The man's movements froze. He couldn't even widen his eyes in surprise. Michael's cold eyes looked at the beast in front of him. Though he felt anger towards the man, he didn't know what to do. To be honest, hunting monsters was an easier task. Michael stared at the motionless man in front of him as he recovered from his emotions. "The city is in chaos now. I don't know why you did this, nor do I care to know since I see no justifiable reason for it. Letting you off is impossible," Michael said slowly. What he didn't say was that it wasn't just him who didn't want to let the man go. His family didn't either. Michael didn't know why, but ever since his first encounter with demonic supernaturals, and the countless human deaths he had witnessed over the past few hours, his interaction with death had shifted. Something told him that if he had the means, he could revive something amazingly different from these corpses. Not the corpses themselves, but something else entirely. Unfortunately, he lacked the means. However, even without the ability to act, Michael could feel the presence of death around him. It almost seemed to speak. And right now, the two bodies in the room seemed to be screaming at him to punish the man in front of him. The daughter's body, in particular, radiated an ominous energy. It was the most potent, giving off an incredible sensation that Michael could extract something from her. Unfortunately, all he could do was feel. He couldn't act. Moments like this made Michael long for an opportunity to join an organization like an academy, where he could expand his knowledge base. An academy, an organization. Yes. In his free time, Michael had often pondered the purpose of an Awakeners Academy. He could see the logic in cultivators having academies, as their progress was steady and structured. But when it came to Awakeners, the concept of learning things in structured terms didn't quite sit right. Sure, knowledge was important. However, teaching a group of people who relied on a system of various advantages, while beneficial, didn't seem entirely necessary to Michael. That was when it hit him. Awakeners academies were probably more like guilds, supernatural associations. Perhaps even cultivation academies operated the same way. Regardless of the details, Michael believed such organizations likely held a much deeper understanding of the supernatural world than anything he could find on forums. While couldn't help but feel he was missing out on something valuable, fate had its plans. For now, his attention was on the issue at hand. In the end, Michael realized that his options were limited. While there were many things he could do, few of them felt appropriate, especially since some of his thoughts might lead to complications later. However, just as Michael had said earlier, he couldn't simply let the man go. Only after a few seconds of thought did Michael figure out what to do. Under the horrified gaze of the man, Michael walked closer and grabbed his hand. Slow curse was still active. When manually controlled, the skill had no cooldown, but the mana consumption increased, and the control became less refined. One upside, though, was that proficiency points increased faster. This will hurt, but you should be able to manage it. Crack. Michael didn't let the man process his words before breaking his right arm. Sweat poured from the man's pores, but under the effects of slow curse, he couldn't even scream. Michael didn't stop there. He helped the man lie flat and continued. Crag. I think that's okay, Michael muttered, uncertain, as he looked at the man on the ground. His limbs were twisted at strange angles. The man had fallen unconscious from the pain, but under the effect of slow curse, his eyes remained wide open. Michael didn't feel disgusted by the sight. To him, he felt the cause of it was because he figured it was because he knew this wouldn't be a difficult issue to resolve with the technology of this world. At the very least, this would stop the man from escaping. When he was done, Michael released his skill's effect. Then he turned to look at the bodies in the sitting room. After restraining the man, Michael immediately felt a shift in the death energy radiating from the two corpses. The daughter's ominous energy felt calmer now, and the mother's did too, though hers felt sad. To anyone else, perhaps even another awakened, the situation might have seemed creepy, but to Michael it was simply intriguing. Can they see me? He wondered. The thought felt absurd since there were no signs of life from the two, but his senses didn't seem to be wrong. Ghosts. The idea felt far-fetched, but given the supernatural phenomena of this world, the existence of ghosts seemed almost normal compared to gods. After pondering for a moment, Michael entered one of the rooms in the apartment, which turned out to be the couple's bedroom. He grabbed a bedsheet and returned to the living room, where he used it to cover the bodies of the mother and daughter. Again, Michael felt a shift in the death energy. It grew even calmer. Michael paused, then spoke aloud. You two can rest now. He'll pay for what he's done, I promise. He'd just been following his instincts, but what happened next completely surprised him. You have brought peace to a common level 1 lingering ghost. You've gained 15 experience points. You have brought peace to a common level 1 lingering ghost. You've gained 13 experience points. Michael was taken aback by the sudden appearance of the panel in front of him. He had known from the start that the situation was strange. Based on his limited experience, death energy was something that accumulated over time. A freshly deceased corpse would have some, but it wouldn't be as intense as that of a corpse that had been decaying for a year. This was already odd about the two corpses, but for them to develop into ghosts was something he hadn't expected, let alone gaining experience points from them. Immediately, Michael turned to carefully sense the energy in the air. After advancing to rank 1, it was easy for him to sense the mana around him. Usually, it was peaceful, making one feel whole yet overwhelmed due to how it covered everything. However, as Michael focused, he noticed a distinct change almost immediately. The mana in the air felt chaotic. It also felt somewhat familiar to him. After thinking about it for a while, he figured out why it felt familiar. For a moment, it felt like he was standing at the entrance of a crack, the lesser version. Did the cracks do more than just unleash monsters across the city? Michael wondered. He felt it shouldn't be surprising. If cracks that filled with chaotic energy that covered the whole city, pouring out monsters, were the only destruction they caused, it would feel somewhat of a win. However, knowing that the mana in the air now felt very close to a crack, it made him think that if this was from a crack, weird things might start emerging soon if left untreated. It's not up to me to think about. If anything happens, let the association deal with it. Despite his thoughts, Michael couldn't shake the sense of urgency. Without wasting time, he left the room through the hole in the wall he'd created earlier. Outside, some of his neighbors were peeking from their doors. Michael ignored them and made his way to the stairs. The moment his foot stepped on the first stair, his figure vanished in a small gust of wind. Seeing that Michael was no longer in sight, the neighbors hesitated to approach and check inside the apartment. They had, just like Aunt Mia, heard the scream from the building. The sound was even more apparent to them since they lived on the same floor, fueling their curiosity. They were also scared. as the voice of the man who had been speaking in a darker tone had suddenly gone silent, leading to several thoughts. In the end, a few men nodded at each other and decided to check the apartment together. They needed to know what was happening in their building during these strange times, or they wouldn't feel safe. A few brave women joined them as well. A few seconds later, a chorus of curses and the scream of a goat being slaughtered and beaten at the same time echoed through the building. Michael didn't immediately return to his apartment. He went out of the building itself. After a few seconds of looking at the sky, he let out a sigh of relief. King-rank cultivators are really something. He couldn't stop himself from expressing his relief. The 3 level 5 cracks in the air, though still present, emitted far less chaotic energy than before. Before, they would have likely collapsed within an hour, but now, before Michael's eyes, the cracks appeared less red. They still existed, but it seemed like they were on the verge of breaking rather than already in the process. So cracks can indeed be stopped, though it seems more like a reversal. Michael took in the new knowledge. In any case, it didn't look like the cracks were going to break anytime soon, nor did it seem like they'd be disappearing soon. At least for now, there was no need to worry about his family's safety. That's what Michael thought at first, until a new thought crossed his mind. There should still be demonic supernaturals in the city, right? Now that he no longer felt an urgent need to protect his family, especially with Lucky and the others by their side, Michael began to entertain different thoughts. His mind wandered, and a familiar greed resurfaced. He was still shocked by the thought even now, but something within him told him it wasn't wrong. Michael wanted a human corpse, but he couldn't bring himself to touch an ordinary human's body, even though they were more than enough in front of him. He wanted one that didn't challenge his sense of morals, one he could still recognize as acceptable. And somehow, he didn't really include demonic supernaturals in that category. For a moment, thoughts of how a human undead might evolve filled his mind. After a short internal struggle, he finally gave up. No, it wasn't the thought he gave up on. It was the hesitation. I'm not even sure I'll be able to do that to a fellow human, but stealing a demonic supernatural's corpse isn't bad, right? That's what Michael decided. He knew what he would have to do if he encountered a living demonic supernatural, but when it came to acquiring the body of one that was already dead, he didn't feel as guilty. In fact, the thought of it didn't make him feel guilty at all. In the end, Michael summoned 2 orcs who were assisting with the cleanup of the community. With their armor on, if one didn't see their face or skin, they would appear as tall figures clad in black armor. Michael gave them a quick glance. Both were at high levels, level 18 to be exact. This wasn't just the highest level among his undead, who had killed the monsters that fell from the cracks. It was also about the level range across his undead. The weakest undead in terms of level was level 16, a huge improvement compared to before the chaos, when they had all been at level 11. After a brief look, Michael decided to call Prince over. He then dismissed Prince to the netherworld and began making his way out of the community. Though he had initially planned to go alone, he changed his mind, realizing he might need more assistance in terms of numbers or strength. Prince, with his appearance, could easily be mistaken for a monster. If a strong person were to attack, thinking it was an escaped monster or he a demonic cultivator, things could turn dangerous. That's why Michael had sent Prince to the netherworld for the time being. With the 2 male undead orcs by his side, Michael set out in search of a corpse to steal. Stealing a corpse should be easy. Michael hoped he wouldn't run into the group of people who had put that thought in his mind, while conveniently ignoring the fact he was responsible for his own thoughts. Well, perhaps stealing a corpse from a graveyard wouldn't be too difficult, especially for a supernatural. However, his target was the body of a demonic supernatural. Unfortunately, the ones who had attacked were far from his community. It seemed like none of them had been willing to die in an unknown corner. In the bustling city where they had been most active, Michael found a pile of corpses stacked together. They all emitted a death energy different from regular supernaturals, an ominous aura. Michael wasn't greedy, he just wanted a few. However, there was a problem. Apparently, in the time he had spent after returning from the association, they had already gathered most of the corpses. He wasn't sure why, but even the bodies of non-demonic supernaturals were missing. Not that he wanted one, but it was still odd. Now Michael had two options: search harder for demonic supernatural corpses or hunt down the living ones. The latter was tricky. Some might have fled the city after the rain of blue flames, either because they were caught in it or because they ran in fear. Of course, he could also try stealing one of the gathered bodies under the watchful eyes of the supernaturals guarding them, but in his opinion, it wasn't worth the risk. Still, it was too early to give up. If, after all the death that had occurred in the city, he couldn't collect a single human corpse, Michael felt he'd be back to the days of being a fake necromancer. As he continued searching, a thought crossed his mind. Would it be possible to buy a human corpse from the association? For some reason, he had a feeling that it was very possible. While searching, Michael subconsciously reduced his standards a bit when he realized that getting a demonic supernatural body might be difficult. He figured that if he encountered another odd situation like the one in his apartment, he might have to do another cleanup if he had the will to go through it to the end. Looking at the drones in the sky that appeared at some point, which showed that even the remnants of the city officials wanted to suppress the chaos more, Michael knew he had to hurry. In a distance somewhat far away from Michael's location, in what happened to be a family building, a duplex, 4 individuals sat in a slightly dim room lit by a candle. The current situation in the sitting room was odd. The 4 rough-looking individuals were scattered around the living room, seemingly anxious about something. While being totally unbothered about the scene, in the middle of the sitting room, the sight of 2 young couples with their necks slightly twisted in an odd angle lay before them. It was obvious who the real owners of the apartment were and who the intruders were. But as power had changed hands, and with no lives left, the 2 couples had no way to complain. One of the men in the room, who had been sitting on a sofa close to the corpses, let out a sigh and turned to look at the corpses with a slightly regretful expression. "Don't you think we should have had fun with them before killing them?" The man spoke softly, but with the power of the other men in the room, it wasn't hard to hear his voice. Hearing his words, no one refuted them. "It's indeed a shame, but we have our lives to worry about now," one of the 4 rough-looking men said. Another among the 4 spoke next. "That's true, but with how the situation is now, shouldn't we have had a little fun since we might not even come out of this alive? It's not like the bodies aren't fresh, so you can still do whatever you want," the last man spoke. The one before him then replied, as he walked closer to the corpse of the man in the couple. "A body will do, but I would have loved to feel his struggle, even if we would still have had to destroy his vocal cords. This and that would have been great to see his expression when he was being." He trailed off into laughter as the others didn't pay attention to him, lost in their own thoughts, as the sound of grunts filled the room. From the way they interacted, it was obvious they were familiar with each other. At least compared to the 2 cultivators Michael had met at the hotel, these 4 interacted closely because they were. The 4 also possessed some power among ordinary people, as they were all at the breaking point of becoming official cultivators. It was also partly due to this reason they joined the dark side. How did the demonic side fill their numbers while staying in the dark alley for years? Through breeding, partly, but no. They filled their numbers with people from the Federation. Even demonic supernaturals had normal lives they lived if they chose to, and some were even advised to live normally. These four were included in this group. The four were originally a small group of extreme drug dealers. Yes, even in another world, lawlessness was a thing, and so was the police. Just because there was magic and technology in this world didn't mean there was no way to commit crimes. It might not be the ones that happened commonly on Earth, but Aurora had its own types. The police here weren't called police but public officers. What differentiated the tasks they performed were the departments within the system. Departments like traffic control and so on. They were also needed in this world. After all, one couldn't expect a supernatural to be in charge of petty tasks or crimes. That was overkill. The demonic side mainly used two methods to increase their ranks: persuasion and threats. For this four-man group, it had been a bit of both. There was a saying, even in the other world, that one shouldn't provoke a stranger because you'll never know what they're going through. The four-man group had experienced the cause and effect of this saying on the day their life started to change. It was supposed to be a usual quick harassment on a lady in a corner. However, they messed with the wrong woman. Initially, they had been a group of 5 rather than 4, but the first one who had done the most to the woman had been the first to die. Though she had later reversed the outcome by using them as a tool for pleasure, the experience they had with her was one filled with fear. It was also the day they had turned into her underlings, and they started to know the real state of the world around them. At first, they had been forced into working for that powerful woman, but under the allure of her words that she could grant them resources for greater power, they had willingly chosen to join her cause to satiate their hunger for power. After agreeing, they received the method by which they could get their power easily. It was one that shocked them, but also one that fitted them extremely well in their line of business, using the blood of living things, preferably intelligent beings, as a cultivation resource to get stronger. In barely 2 weeks after getting the method, they were now close to becoming a rank 1 cultivator. According to the words of that woman, after advancing, they get stronger power and live a better life. However, if they wanted more opportunities to get stronger and advance more levels, they could make grand contributions. And she said the opportunity to contribute was coming soon. All they had to do was follow the crowd after the signal. The signal, oh yes, they did see it. However, did they join after finding out what it was? No, they didn't. They tried and almost died before managing to enter this building to hide, after using ordinary people as cover to defend or bind time in their escapes in the eyes of the Association Supernaturals. Fortunately, they didn't have the time to focus on them, so they were able to escape. However, even if they weren't the smartest around, they knew they couldn't come outside boldly like ordinary citizens in disguise. If they got caught, they were done for. Unfortunately, the city was on high alert now, even with the lingering chaos, so they couldn't risk it. Eventually, one of the men couldn't hold it anymore and spoke. It was around this time that one of them had just finished his business. "Do you think we should look for that woman?" the man said. "That bitch. At first I thought we were special, but looking at those monsters with people capable of fighting them, it's obvious she wanted to use us as cannon fodder. We're not even sure she's still alive after that fire wipeout," another man said, trembling at his last sentence. He didn't believe there was anyone in the city who wouldn't have been shocked by what they saw. Though they had hidden in the building throughout and were lucky not to have been affected, it wasn't as if they hadn't paid attention to the world outside. Hearing the man's words, the whole space was silent for a while, until the one who had just finished his business with the male body of the dead couple spoke in a laid-back tone. "In the end, we'll still have to leave here. If not, it would only get worse. Right now, though, it's risky to move out, but it's also the best time before things really get peaceful. By then, escaping outside of the city would be impossible. When the man spoke, it was like he was talking about taking a walk in the park. It was evident that he had chosen to accept his fate. Silence reigned for a while before another spoke. He's right. Staying passive is not going to help us, so let's just risk it. However, before moving, I'm going to have some short fun, brothers, haha. You fucking bastard. Let me join you. Wish one was still newly fresh. Evidently, this group was worse than the one in Michael's apartment. However, they all remained in the same category. At least, if Michael was to categorize them. They were good materials to create an undead. Michael didn't really know whether to say he was unlucky due to his intentions, but even after expanding his search, he still didn't see a single demonic corpse to steal. Rather, what littered the area was the corpses of monsters. It was a little ironic that these were things Michael would have killed for in the past, but though they still made his mouth water, they currently appeared to be less valuable at the moment. At some point, he started to seriously ponder about stealing a corpse under the eyes of the supernaturals around. Maybe if he was careful enough, they wouldn't even notice. He could also wait to see if he could buy one in the future, but asking about that question now at a sensitive time didn't seem like the right thing to do. Also, if he actually waited for something he wasn't even sure about, he could actually miss an actual corpse. In the end, Michael just decided to keep on searching. He didn't know why, but the chaotic energy from the cracks became increasingly stabilized, so he was no longer in a hurry. And just like that, Michael continued searching until he came into a relatively complete but very quiet community. Not thinking much about it, Michael continued his search until he was just about to pass a building when he sensed something that made him pause. A smile formed on his face. Finally, just as Brian had said, judging someone based on their aura was a risky thing to do. Michael understood this better than anyone. After all, he was a necromancer. Though he didn't think his aura would be outright repulsive to other supernaturals with keen senses. He figured it would stand out a bit. However, it probably wouldn't be too conspicuous since he hadn't involved himself in the kind of filthy practices a certain group indulged in. Still, whether it was due to his class or simply a natural progression of strength, Michael had developed an acute sensitivity to certain energies. He could now distinguish between a regular supernatural and a demonic one, at least, as long as they weren't using aura concealment techniques and were not far stronger than him. Otherwise, his senses would be useless. This time, Michael was certain he had finally caught a fish. However, whether it was a big one or not remained to be seen. The community was eerily quiet, its ruins scattered with monster and human corpses, though in noticeably lower numbers than in other places he had visited. It seemed that any survivors had already been transported elsewhere. Yet, as he passed a particular building, Michael felt a surge of ominous negative energy. What was strange, however, was that, while his senses clearly detected the presence of such energy, he couldn't pick up any signs of life. Such impressive concealment. That was the only thought that crossed his mind. Unfortunately for the hidden individual, some energies coding them weren't as easy to suppress. Their cries. Michael wasn't sure he should call them that. He could hear them. At the very least, this suggested that the other party wasn't strong enough to completely erase everything from Michael's perception. Even so, Michael wasn't about to take any chances. As for whether there was a living person behind that wall, at that moment, the thought didn't even cross his mind. However, it seemed that the moment Michael paused, the other party had noticed. However, it seemed they weren't willing to take any chances. Just as Michael got ready to summon Prince, while also wanting to order the two male orc undead by his side to get ready, The wall of the building he had his eyes on burst open. Immediately, a figure in black appeared right on the street and started running. "It's low curse." Michael's mind reacted immediately, and he cast a skill on the figure. The feedback he felt immediately allowed him to know that he had underestimated a bit. The demonic supernatural. This one. It was a powerful one. Just as Slow Curse struggled to hold the fugitive, Michael was already casting another spell. Undead Summoning. Immediately, a huge magic circle appeared in front of him, and the figure of a wolf started emerging from it at a rapid speed. At the same time, Michael mentally commanded the two orcs beside him to rush at the figure. All this happened in a flash, yet the figure was also able to react. Michael watched as they cast a spell, even while semi-motionless. A magic circle appeared right beneath their feet, and an earth dome formed against them. Bang! The two hammer-wielding orcs sent a string of attacks at the dome, causing dust to fly everywhere. Suddenly, Michael's expression twitched. "Come back!" As he screamed the command while sending it to the two orcs mentally, Michael watched as two magic circles appeared in midair above the dome, and two huge fire spears shot out from them. Unfortunately, the orcs had just started retreating when the fire spears appeared in front of them. Fortunately, their instincts kicked in, and their bodies moved to strike their hammers at the fire spears. Boom! An explosion echoed as the two undead flew past Michael due to the shockwave. In a matter of 2 seconds, a few blows had already been exchanged, and from them, Michael immediately realized that he had encountered not only a strong opponent but one with good battle experience. However, Michael didn't give up or retreat immediately. He might be lacking in experience, but not in firepower. Awu! Prince, who had already emerged from the netherworld, wasted no time in attacking immediately. Thick vines erupted from the ground and charged at the earth dome ahead when it suddenly broke off, revealing the figure in black and a huge red magic circle in front of them. Michael didn't need to know what it was. He sensed a huge threat from it, and that was enough. Leaving Prince to deal with the situation however he liked, Michael immediately dashed away from the place. And just as he had expected, the magic circle was indeed bad news. A wide stream of hot flames appeared from the magic circle, charging at Prince, who immediately set up a vine wall around itself. Unfortunately, plants just happened to be the worst counter for fire. It only fueled the flames more. However, it still did its work of stopping the flames. Unfortunately, the magic circle didn't seem to be a stagnant one. For the first time, Michael was able to see what a cultivator could do if they went all out in a residential space in a fight. It was destructive. In just a few seconds, flames filled the whole area. One could only imagine how it would have been if people had actually been around. Perhaps they were some in fact not this were not within Michael and his opponent's current considerations. The moment the magic on the magic circle ran out was the moment Michael was able to strike back. Well, not him exactly, but his undead. At this point, Michael realized that it was a mage he was up against. Really, the firepower that they could output was a lot. No wonder they were even considered rare in the class classification system. Even in the cultivator power system, Michael hadn't met a lot of mages. However, while powerful, Michael knew that mages had one great weakness: their physique. It was weak. Just as the magic circle that caused the stream of fire disappeared and another one started to appear, the shadow of Prince appeared right behind the mage, and with a claw, it sent the mage flying. Bang, bang, bang. The mage flew through multiple buildings in a flash. Not willing to give their opponent a moment's rest, Michael and his undead chased after the figure. A moment later, they found the mage trying to get up from the ground with their body trembling a lot. Obviously, Michael wasn't going to allow this to happen. With a mental command, he ordered Prince to strike again. On the roof of a building, Michael also made a move. However, it seemed that while his actions were right, they had still given the mage enough time. 2 magic circles appeared around the mage. Strangely, the 2 weren't directed at Prince's flashing figure, with one directed at Michael's location. Shit. Michael didn't even think about it, and immediately dashed to another location. Unfortunately, though the mage had managed in stopping Michael from casting a spell, it was too much to think a single attack spell could hold Prince in place. Bang! Out of sight from Michael's eyes, who due to his haste had blasted himself into a building, Prince with its huge claw slammed the body of the mage to the ground. With the body of the mage, a crater formed on the ground. However, the mage still had a bit of life in them. It was evident from the event that even as a mage, though they had the weakest physique among most professions, they were still strong and had great vitality. However, all these had no business to do with Prince. Wasting no time, Prince gave another claw attack. Bang! The crater in the ground got a bit deeper. Bang! Yet another attack. Bang! Yet another attack to the mage on the ground. Just as it was about to deliver another attack to finally end the life of the mage, a sudden scream echoed. Stop! Prince's attack halted immediately. From a certain building, Michael shot up and charged at the mage's body on the ground. Finally close, a spear materialized in his hand, and without hesitation he struck down. You have killed Michael didn't even turn to look at the notifications that appeared nor reflect on what he had just done, and immediately placed the body in his storage space. Dismissing all his undead, he immediately charged out of the location. A few seconds later, a few figures appeared in the sky. One might imagine that a battle between figures akin to gods in the eyes of ordinary humans would be a long and devastating clash. Devastating, yes. Long. Only if both sides were evenly matched. In a fight where power was unequal from the very start, even a god could fall in an instant. Of course, the force capable of erasing such a being in the blink of an eye had to be just as terrifying. Had the battle between the mage and Michael been a one-on-one duel, Michael would have lost easily. Battle experience, a vast arsenal of spells. Michael had none of these, at least not compared to that mage. However, a one-on-one fight was never an option for Michael. He was a necromancer. I think this is far enough, Michael muttered, scanning his surroundings. It was another ruined community. Much like the rest of the city. Through his senses, he picked up faint signs of life around. The association had likely done what they could hear before moving on, for now. But for Michael, this place was far enough. Sitting atop a rooftop, he took a deep breath, calming himself. Cultivators are strong, he mused. In spellcasting at least, that mage had been far ahead of him. But Michael didn't feel discouraged. He had only been a supernatural for barely a week. Now that he thought about it, he had come far, and fast, just when he thought he was moving too slowly. His gaze swept over the ruins around him. So many things have happened in just a few days. A strange emotion stirred within him, but he pushed it aside. He had gotten what he wanted. Now, it was time to return to his community before someone else arrived first and they ran into trouble with his undead, or vice versa. As for the result of his battle with the mage, that could wait. As for taking a human life for the first time, Michael didn't even think about it. Maybe it was because he had already killed too much in a short span, today and in the past few days. Maybe he had grown numb to it. Or maybe he was just coping. Only Michael would know. But just as he was about to leave, he felt movement from within the building beneath him. 4 people, that's a lot, lucky people. Michael merely thought to himself, but just as he was about to move, he paused. A faint wail seemed to whisper to him. Slowly, Michael lowered himself on the building below, his expressionless eyes flashing for a brief moment. A second later, an eerie butterfly appeared beside him, fluttering around as a mist began to rise. Undead Phantomorpho, LV2. Illusory Mirage, Basic Mastery Proficiency, 6.7%. Creates multiple shimmering duplicates of itself to confuse enemies. At Basic Mastery, the illusions move erratically but fade upon contact, making it harder for foes to pinpoint the real creature. Mist No. The power of illusion slowly enveloped the building beneath Michael. In the apartment building, the 4 men who had initially started with corpses to themselves prepared to move out. As for how things ended up that way, they couldn't quite tell. All they knew was that something within them had urged them to act, whispering that what they were doing was right, pleasurable, even. It wasn't that they hadn't done it before, but never in a situation as serious as this. Yet they felt an irresistible urge to unearth even deeper desires. Even now, the urge to cause more chaos simmered within them, but the pressing need to escape the city forced them to suppress their bloodlust. If Michael knew about this, he would attribute it to the cracks. As he had suspected, if the only thing the cracks did was release monsters, then in a certain way, it wasn't the worst possible outcome. Unfortunately, from the ghosts he had encountered, it was clear that something even stranger was happening in the city. Being influenced by the chaotic energy in the air seemed very plausible. When did the fog appear? One of the men cautiously opened the entrance door, only to be met with a thick, swirling mist that obscured almost everything beyond. The others behind him also noticed the change, their expressions turning serious. "Close the door," one of them stated as another moved toward a window to check outside. Was this window always open? He briefly wondered but quickly dismissed the thought. Just like the scene at the entrance, the outside was shrouded in fog. "Is something weird happening again?" the man muttered worriedly, unaware of the glowing green eyes that had appeared behind him. Wait, the fog is getting inside." He noticed the mist creeping in through the gaps and immediately shut the window, but it made no difference. The fog only grew denser. Just as he turned to speak, his body suddenly stiffened. Confusion flashed across his face as he struggled to move. Then, he felt a cold hand wrap around his neck. A moment later, his neck snapped. As his vision darkened, the last thing he heard was a voice, deep and enigmatic, yet strangely youthful. "Trash alive, you'll make an excellent undead." Michael stared at the lifeless body in his grip, his expression unreadable. Now that he had a moment to reflect, he finally thought about his actions. Yet even as he did, he felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. If anything, he felt a little excited. Such fragility, it gave him an intoxicating sense of power. However, Michael didn't allow himself to get lost in the feeling. Old Man Liu and Teacher Brian were right. Killing a lot in a short span really messes you up. He understood the gravity of it. But understanding didn't mean he could change what had happened, at least, not right now. It wasn't as if he was killing for the sake of it. "Who are you?" Michael heard a voice behind him and turned, letting the body in his grasp drop to the floor. He had snuck into the building to uncover what was happening without revealing his identity, just in case he was wrong. But he wasn't. The moment he struck down his target, he was ready to face the remaining 3. Michael didn't answer the question. He sighed and vanished from his spot. The reason Michael left immediately after defeating the mage was that he knew there was a chance the battle would draw the attention of the association members. He didn't think he'd be in trouble for fighting a demonic supernatural, but he doubted he'd be allowed to take the corpse himself. What he didn't know was that, shortly after he left, two figures appeared midair at the battle site. Rank 4 cultivators. The two arrivals were both men. They scanned the surroundings before one of them spoke. There are multiple energy signatures here. It's chaotic, but the dominant ones are fire and wood. Should we track the lingering traces? I can sense dark energy as well, though faint. There's no need to waste time. The demonic supernaturals wouldn't dare cause too much havoc. Though I don't know why one fought here, it's not our concern. Our priority is restoring order to the city. If we don't do something about the chaotic energy in time, things will only spiral further. Agreed. With that, the two men ended their discussion. Rather than chase after a fleeing demonic supernatural, it was far more important to stabilize the situation. If their negligence led to a disaster requiring a king-rank expert's intervention, there would be nothing they could do, even as some of the strongest cultivators below the king level in Woodstone City. Having made their decision, they immediately flew off in another direction. Of course, things would have been different had they seen Michael, but they didn't care enough to track down a vague trail. Back at Michael's location, moments later. Unlike when he had used Slow Curse on the first man, Michael didn't bother doing the same for the remaining three. All were given swift deaths, a single precise strike to the back of the neck. After finishing off the last one, Michael paused briefly before storing the 4 bodies in his storage space, recalling his undead phantom morpho as well. Though he felt a moment of unexpected discomfort, it quickly faded, replaced by growing excitement. Initially, he had worried that due to the Super's association intervening, preventing him from obtaining a demonic supernatural's corpse, he'd return home empty-handed. Yet not only had he secured the body of a strong supernatural, he had also acquired 4 ordinary corpses. Michael was quite satisfied with the outcome. Of course, he wished he could revive one immediately and begin the process of evolving it, but he wasn't in the right situation to indulge in such desires. The city was still unstable, and he had a community to protect. Besides, though physically unharmed, he was mentally exhausted. Some proper rest wouldn't be a bad idea. Just as he was about to leave, a series of notifications appeared before him, a familiar sight. You have brought peace to a common level 3 lingering ghost. You have gained 33 experience points. You have brought peace to a common level 4 lingering ghost. You have gained 38 experience points. Michael didn't need to think twice to understand which ghosts he had helped pass on. His gaze shifted to the couple's bodies on the ground. After a moment of contemplation, he walked through the house and retrieved a blanket. Just as he had done for the mother and daughter back in his apartment, Michael covered the couple's bodies as well. Unlike before, this didn't cause a further drop in negative energy. It had already been diminishing from the moment the ghosts had been put to rest. Necromancer, necromancy. There's still a lot I don't understand, he muttered. But that was fine. Michael loved that he had things to look forward to. Whatever, let's get back home. With that, he stepped out of the building, greeted by a slightly brighter atmosphere. After a long night of fighting, it seemed the sun was finally preparing to rise over this ruined city. As Michael flashed from his spot, moments later, high in the sky, a group of people emerged from the crack. Though they tried to contain it, their aura still leaked, causing the space around them to tremble. It was evident who these people were. The king-rank cultivators sent to resolve the level 5 cracks in Woodstone City. However, these supposedly dignified figures looked like a mess. Setting aside their strange armor and weapons, most were drenched in blood, some from the monsters they had battled within the cracks, and some their own. One had even lost an arm, yet his expression remained indifferent, as if such an injury was trivial. Among them, only a few remained relatively unscathed, aside from exhaustion. One was Quiet Blade. The other, both an expected and unexpected presence, was Brian, the newly ascended king-rank cultivator, the Mad Phoenix. Though he was grouped alongside Quiet Blade, it wasn't due to lack of contribution he was unscratched. On the contrary, he had shown faint signs of matching the strongest among them. The gazes directed at him were now more serious, caution, respect, and something else. Yet Brian himself seemed unconcerned with their stares. Sensing the crack he had just exited, and those still remaining, he spoke. "We've cleared a third of each crack twice. Though we're close to completely clearing these artificial cracks, we have to admit we're in no condition to continue, unless we're ready to lose one or more of our own." The other kings remained silent, but their expressions showed agreement. "Right on cue," Quiet Blade added. "A lot is bound to change after this, but for now, let's return and rest. With the cracks in their current state, we can afford to delay clearing them." King-rank cultivators retreated to recover wherever they could. As they had decided, it wasn't too late to resume clearing the cracks since the immediate danger had been dealt with. They could afford to take their time. Pushing themselves beyond their limits now would only increase the risk of death, a risk none of them were willing to take. No matter how precious the rewards were, they weren't worth the centuries of life they still had ahead of them. One by one, the king-rank cultivators left. Brian also flashed back to the Supers Association, but instead of making his presence known, he teleported straight into the office of the people in charge. At that moment, the branch manager of the Supers Association and Deputy Manager Leo were deep in discussion about the current state of the city. "The situation isn't looking good," Deputy Manager Leo stated grimly. The branch manager, a mid-rank rank 4 knight, and Leo, a late-stage rank 3 knight, were among the most powerful figures in Woodstone City, especially now, after the chaos had claimed even some of the city's strongest defenders. Though not the most powerful, Deputy Manager Leo's organizational skills were unmatched. There were stronger individuals who could take his position, but very few who could handle it as efficiently as he did. And while Aurora was a world where strength reigned supreme, talent and leadership couldn't be ignored. And Leo was far from weak. "Just tell me how bad it is," the branch manager sighed, rubbing his temples in exhaustion. "And sit down, will you? Watching you stand there is making me dizzy." Leo hesitated. He wasn't used to sitting in front of his superiors, but after a brief moment of consideration, he took the seat opposite the manager. Even for him, the night's events had been exhausting. Just as Deputy Manager Leo was about to speak, a figure suddenly appeared in the office, startling both him and the branch manager. Their instincts kicked in immediately, but before they could react, an overwhelming pressure crashed down on them. Their bodies refused to move. A suffocating weight bore down on their shoulders, leaving them frozen in place, sweat trickling down their backs as they stared in awe. "You two should relax. I'm just here to talk," Brian said calmly, withdrawing the oppressive force he had released. "Sorry about that, by the way." "It's okay, Your Honor," the branch manager quickly responded, forcing a polite smile. Deputy Manager Leo nodded stiffly in agreement. Starting from the 4th rank of cultivation, the master rank, cultivators were given titles of respect. Back when Brian was still a master rank cultivator, he had been addressed as Master Brian, a sign of both recognition and respect. Now that he had stepped into the king rank, he was referred to as Your Honor. At Emperor rank, he would be called Your Highness. And at demigod rank, he would earn the title of Lord. At a certain point, even the Federation, which had tried its best not to create a strength-based hierarchy, had to acknowledge the inevitable reality. Power alone dictated status. Seeing that Deputy Manager Leo was about to stand up and offer his seat, Brian immediately spoke to stop him. "There's no need for you to stand up," he said. "Just tell me the current state of the city." Deputy Manager Leo didn't like the idea of sitting while the other party stood, but he could tell from Brian's tone that his words were absolute. Respecting the decision, he did not argue. However, he also chose not to sit. Instead, he remained standing to address Brian. Seeing this, the branch manager, who had originally planned to remain seated, felt uncomfortable. In the end, he stood as well. Brian noticed their actions, but couldn't be bothered to care about them. His focus was on the report. "The city is in a dire state," Deputy Manager Leo began. "The population has dropped by a staggering 45%, and it's estimated to decline even further due to the lack of proper medical care. Fortunately, the branch manager of the other branch can perform healing arts, but her spells are only rank 1. After fighting for so long, she is reaching her limit. However, based on estimates, she can still save around 20% of the expected casualties." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. Then he continued. "The next issue, one just as concerning as the cracks in the sky, is the chaotic energy spreading through the city. Due to its influence, people are becoming more prone to negative actions. Those who engage in violence or crime feel an even stronger urge to continue. So far, it hasn't affected supernaturals, but its presence still causes serious issues. While the energy is gradually dissipating, thanks to your honor and the other king-rank cultivators, it still lingers, and we fear it may breed something unnatural." Leo took another breath before delivering the next grim report. "We've also lost a significant number of supernaturals. Based on our data and additional reports from the other branch, we've lost at least half of the registered supernaturals. Most of the casualties are rank 2 elite cultivators and below. We've also lost a few commander rank supernaturals. Master rank casualties are minimal." Leo's voice grew heavier. "Also, due to the reversal of the level 5 cracks, they are now permanent. Unlike before, when these cracks would eventually disappear, they are now as stable as natural cracks. This means they will never disappear. Because of this, we may have no choice but to evacuate the entire city. It's one thing to have cracks hidden away, but it's another to see them every day, looming over us. And beyond that, the city itself is simply too damaged to remain livable. There was a reason why cracks were usually sealed within specialized containers. Unfortunately, level 5 cracks had already surpassed what most containers could handle. Though the cracks wouldn't break now, or for a very long time, for several reasons, this level of crack weren't exactly the best places to live near for ordinary humans. And that was just from the perspective of supernaturals. Only the surviving government officials truly understood how devastating the situation was for the general public as a whole. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.